We are looking at Milton's Essay of Education, page 173 of this edition. Bottom of the page, so Milton proposes to set up an academy where pupils from the age of 12 to 20 will be admitted, and they will get an education which will prepare them for being rulers. So it will be a kind of an elite education. First, to find out a spacious house and ground about it fit for an academy, and big enough to lodge 150 persons, whereof 20 or thereabout may be attendants, all under the government of one, who shall be thought of desert sufficient, and ability either to do all or wisely to direct and oversee it done. So he proposes to set up an academy of residential complex with 150 students and a director or an administrator and 20 attendants. Thus he proposes to have complete control over the students and their schedule of learning throughout the day. This place should be at once both school and university, not needing a remove to any other house of scholarship, except it be some peculiar college or of law or physic where they mean to be practitioners. So all liberal education will be given and received in this institution, beginning from school up to the university level in a continuous fashion, and students will not have to move to any other institution unless they want to learn something specialized like law or medicine. But as for those general studies which take up all our time, from Lily to the commencing, as they term it, Master of Art, it should be absolute. Lily is William Lily, the grandfather of John Lily, Shakespeare's predecessor, the dramatist and writer of prose romance. His grandfather William Lily wrote a grammar of English which was very popular. So students began their education with Lily, and then up to the Master of Arts, commencement of the Master of Arts. So continuous education from almost primary to the master's level, not primary, I suppose 12 would be like secondary, to the master's level, this education will be practiced. After this pattern, as many edifices may be converted to this use as shall be needful in every city throughout this land, which would tend much to the increase of learning and civility everywhere. So Milton says that this is a model institution, and such institutions will be replicated in different cities throughout England. Thus you see that he is kind of planning education for the whole country. Of course, in response to Samuel Hartley's prompting, he desires such institutions to be throughout the country. This number, less or more thus collected to the convenience of a foot company or interchangeably 2 troops of cavalry, should divide their day's work into 3 parts as it lies orderly: their studies, their exercise and their diet. So here Milton is comparing the school system to the military system, and as in the military system, cavalry and regiments, they have a fixed number of soldiers. An infantry foot company could number up to 200 men. A squadron of cavalry could number from 1 to 200. In the same way, the number of students will be controlled. They will be regimented either in 100 or in 150 or in 200. So we see that Milton supposes that there should be a regimentation in learning also as in the army or in the military, which suggests that discipline is extremely important in learning. So students will be raised up as disciplined as soldiers. And the whole education of students is divided by Milton into three parts: studies, exercise and diet. Now this is in rhetorical terms partitio or divisio. Any topic would be divided. So the topic of education is divided into three. Of course, Milton is going to talk mostly about studies, a little about exercise, because exercise refers to physical exercise, which is a very important part of a student's growth and development. And diet. Diet is very important, but of course Milton is not going to talk much about it. Only one or two sentences at the end of the essay. For their studies, first they should begin with the chief and necessary rules of some good grammar, either that now used or any better. And while this is doing, their speech is to be fashioned to a distinct and clear pronunciation, as near as may be to the Italian, especially in the vowels. Pronunciation was also a part of rhetoric. So Milton refers to grammar. Grammar meant the science of writing. Grammatike, the science of writing. But of course, the science of writing means the science of composing sentences. Therefore, grammar was given a lot of importance at the early levels. You remember that the three subjects of the trivium were grammar, logic and rhetoric. But in Milton's scheme, logic comes much later because it is more difficult. But grammar and rhetoric one cannot do without. It must be learned at the very beginning, at least grammar. Rhetoric also comes a little later in Milton's scheme. And pronunciation is very important, and Italians pronounce their vowels very clearly. But the English people do not pronounce their vowels clearly. Most of them are half distinct or not very clear. So Milton suggests that students should be taught to pronounce their vowels clearly like the Italians. For we Englishmen, being far northerly, do not open our mouths in the cold air wide enough to grace a southern tongue, but are observed by all other nations to speak exceeding close and inward. So because the English live in a cold climate, they do not open their mouths like those who live in the southern part of Europe, like the Italians. Therefore, they do not pronounce their vowels clearly. So that to smatter Latin with an English mouth is as ill a hearing as law French. So law French was proverbially bad language, in the sense that French written by the English would be kind of distorted and not very perfect. And in the legal documents after the Norman invasion, the custom of writing legal documents, particularly documents related to land, those were written in French, and that law French was very poor, kind of language. So Milton says that if Englishmen pronounce Latin with an English mouth, that is, they do not pronounce the vowels clearly, then it is as bad as law French. Next, to make them expert in the usefulest points of grammar, and withal to season them and win them early to the love of virtue and true labour, where any flattering seducement or vain principle sees them wandering, some easy and delightful book of education would be read to them. Notice the moral tone. There are books of education which are flattering, and they induce laziness. Before students can read any such books, they should be well principled in learning the points of grammar and also moral virtues. So it seems that there is a connection between the two, learning the principles of grammar and moral virtue, as if those who do not learn grammar well, they do not learn virtue. So this is the humanist bias. Grammar is very important. If somebody learns grammar well, grammar is a kind of discipline. So one learns how to order one's language, one's words in a sentence, how to inflect them according to case and number, therefore mood. Therefore grammar is a kind of a discipline, and one who undertakes this training in discipline in language would also be disciplined in terms of morality. Delightful book of education, before any vain principle or flattering seducement seize them, they should read some good books of education, delightful and easy books of education. And what are the examples? The Greeks have stored as Civis, Plutarch and other Socratic discourses. So Civis of Thebes in Greece, he is a character in Plato's Phaedo as an associate of Socrates. A popular Renaissance text called Pinax of Civis. It had parallel columns of Greek and Latin. So I am writing Pinax by Civis. So it was a popular book for children, for students, believed to be written by Civis, who has been mentioned by Plato in his book Phaedo, in his dialogue Phaedo, as an associate of Socrates, but probably it was a different Civis. So this is one of the Greek books. Plutarch, you all know that Plutarch wrote Moralia. He was a Greek biographer, historian and moral philosopher, very popular in the Renaissance. Even in Presidency University Library or Presidency College Library, there are volumes of Plutarch's Moralia, which of course have not been lasted probably for the last 100 years. But it was a very important part of education for the Renaissance. And Socratic discourses, that is the dialogues written by Plato, the dialogues which are apparently by Socrates but written down by Plato. But in Latin we have none of classic authorities extant except 2 or 3 books of Quintilian. So why is the Latin canon so poor? So Milton here is not thinking about the canon of literature, poetry or tragedy, or he is thinking about books of education, pedagogical books for children, and for that he can only mention Quintilian. Quintilian, wrote his Institutio Oratoria, the book of rhetoric by Quintilian, in several volumes. Oratoria means rhetoric, and Institutio means introduction to any subject. So the introduction of the knowledge of rhetoric. So that was, Quintilian was a schoolmaster, and this book of rhetoric was the staple of Renaissance pedagogy in Latin. Other books must have been there, but they have been lost. So Milton says that only Quintilian is extant, and some select pieces elsewhere, but here the main skill and groundwork will be to temper them such lectures and explanations upon every opportunity as may lead and draw them in willing obedience, inflamed with the study of learning and the admiration of virtue, stirred up with high hopes of living to be brave men and worthy patriots, and so on. So temper is a verb that we use with respect to tempering of a metal, say tempering of the steel in forging a sword or something. So temper means subjecting something to a rigorous discipline or rigorous experience, after which it becomes tempered, which means that it can withstand a lot of difficulties or assaults. So the students' minds need to be tempered so that they can accept things with equanimity, and they become inflamed, that is inspired with the desire of inculcating virtue, and they would be obedient, they would like to study, they would love learning, and they would admire virtue, and thus they would be worthy patriots. So you see how all these values are brought together: obedience, learning, moral virtue, and all these make one also a good patriot. That they may despise and scorn all their childish and ill-taught qualities, to delight in manly and liberal exercises, which he who has the art and proper eloquence to catch them with, what with mild and effectual persuasions, and what with the intimation of some fear, if need be, but chiefly by his own example, might in a short space gain them to an incredible diligence and courage. So this is a prescription for liberal studies. Liberal means pursuits which are suitable for a gentleman, and these should be taught in such a way that the students love to study these things, or if not, then they might also be made to fear the punishments. So that is also mentioned here, so that in a short space with a lot of diligence they learn. At the same time, some other hour of the day might be taught them the rules of arithmetic, and soon after the elements of geometry, even playing as the old manner was. Geometry may be taught through playing, that is through games, and this is what was recommended by Plato, that geometry may be taught through games. So arithmetic, geometry, these are the things that belong to the so-called 3 R's, writing, reading, and arithmetic. So basic education should comprise also arithmetic, geometry, all these things. After evening repast, till bedtime, their thoughts will be best taken up in the easy grounds of religion. You notice the frequent use of the word easy. So Milton makes it appear that learning anything is very easy. Religion is also an easy ground. It is not difficult. So I wonder what is difficult to Milton, because in this essay everything is presented to be extremely easy, and the syllabus that Milton provides us, that contains all the classical languages, because language learning is very easy according to Milton, and nothing is difficult. So the story of scripture, so if we look at religion as story, the stories of the Bible can be learned even in one's childhood. The next step would be to the authors of agriculture. So agriculture is a practical science which is needed when one grows up, but I suppose Milton includes agriculture here because he thinks it to be an easy discipline, something very easy to learn, and the authors are Cato, Varro, and Columella. So these are all Latin authors. Cato the Elder wrote De Agricultura, a book on agriculture. Varro wrote De Re Rustica, and Columella wrote De Re Rustica. So they all wrote on agriculture and rustic things, that is, things related to agriculture or the field. for the matter is most easy. So I told you why agriculture is being prescribed here, because it is most easy. And if the language is difficult, so much the better. It is not a difficulty above their ears. So it is good to have a text written in difficult language, because then students can master that difficulty also. So for students, everything is easy and things should be difficult, so that they also learn how to master difficulty. And here will be an occasion of inciting and enabling them hereafter to improve the tillage of their country, to recover the bad soil, and to remedy the waste that is made of wood. For this was one of Hercules' praises. So to till the soil, to turn bad land into good land by the art of manuring. And Hercules' praise is that Hercules, while cleaning the Augean stables, accidentally discovered the art of manuring. So the filth or the bad things, they can be put to good use by turning them into manures. Here half these authors be read, which will soon be with flying hard and daily. They cannot choose but be masters of any ordinary prose. So if one reads all these books on agriculture in Latin, then they will quickly become master of Latin prose. So you see that Milton does not want to teach them Latin separately. They are made to read Latin prose so that they become the masters of prose. And actually that is how Latin is taught even today. So you are given prose and poems, prose pieces and poems to read, and by reading them, while reading them you learn the grammar, so that it will be then seasonable for them to learn in any modern author the use of the globes. The use of the word modern is very interesting in such early modern writers like Milton, because by modern he means his contemporaries. So the early modern people, they are modern in which sense they are different from the medieval. So for example, the number of disciplines and sciences which were burgeoning, which were developing during the Renaissance, they changed the entire medieval outlook about the world. So the geography, our modern idea of the earth being a round globe and not a flat piece of land, so that kind of discovery or theories were made available for the first time in this period. Therefore, compared to the medieval and ancient theories of learning, the books in the Renaissance, they all produced theories which one may call modern, because they differed from those. So globes, use of globes, that is learning the geography, learning the cosmology, all the maps first with the old names and then with new, or they might then be capable to read any compendious method of natural philosophy. So natural philosophy meant science. Compendious method, that is books which methodically contain useful facts. So they were like guidebooks in the Renaissance, and they ordered things, they ordered facts in a methodical manner, and because of that compact or compendious books became very popular in the Renaissance. The names of course changed from the ancient times. In the Renaissance they were given new names, and at the same time might be entering into the Greek tongue after the same manner as was before prescribed in the Latin. So the students will learn Greek language by reading Greek books about geography or other topics, just as they learned Latin by reading books on agriculture, whereby the difficulties of grammar being soon overcome, all the historical physiology of Aristotle and Theophrastus are open before them. Physiology here refers to the sciences of zoology and botany. So Aristotle wrote books on animals and on plants. and historical means narrated methodically. So the books here on natural history by Aristotle are Historia Animalium, De Partibus Animalium and De Generatione Animalium. History of animals, the divisions of animals and the generation of animals. So these are the three books by Aristotle. And Theophrastus was the father of scientific botany, because he was the first Greek philosopher who wrote books on botany. He authored Historia Plantarum, that is inquiry into plants, and De Causis Plantarum, or the etiology of plants. Of course he wrote in Greek, but these are the Latin translations of the titles by his book, of his books. And as I will say, under contribution, the like access will be to Vitruvius, to Seneca's Natural Questions, to Mela, Celsus, Pliny or Solinus. Vitruvius was the most famous most famous architect of the Renaissance, and his book was De Architectura, and he imagined man to be the measure of the universe, and there is a famous drawing of the Vitruvian man by Leonardo da Vinci, a man spreading his legs and his arms, standing within a circle, his feet and his hands touching the circle. So the man defines this space of the circle, and a particular geometrical proportion can be derived from the proportion of the man's body within the circle. So this was called the Vitruvian man, because Vitruvius imagined man to be the yardstick by which to measure space. Then other writers like Seneca wrote the Natural Questions, book on natural philosophy. Pomponius Mela was a Roman geographer and author of De Chorographia. In ancient times, geography was sometimes called chorography. De Chorographia by Mela. And Celsus was the author of De Medicina. Solinus was a Roman geographer and author of Rerum Memorabilium. So these are the Greek and Roman geographers. Pliny, of course, wrote a book on natural history, which was the great source of all Renaissance writers, including Shakespeare. Pliny's Natural History. And having thus passed the principles of arithmetic, geometry, astronomy and geography with a general compact of physics, that is basic structure in natural science. So we have to be very careful, because 17th century writers, 16th and 17th century writers, they call medicine physics, which is without S. But sometimes they also use the word physics. Today by physics we mean a particular kind of, a particular branch of physical science, but physics for Milton meant natural science in general. They may descend in mathematics to the instrumental science of trigonometry. Descent here refers to the logical method of deriving the particular from the general. That is, going down from the general to the particular. So, which is the inductive method. The deductive method is just the opposite, from particular to general. Now you all know that Aristotle mostly taught the deductive logic, and Francis Bacon was against it, and in his New Organon Bacon said that inductive logic, that is from general to particular, should be taught. So mathematical science of trigonometry, which was a basic science of measuring things, that should be taught. And then fortification, architecture, engineering, or navigation. Engineering here refers to military use of engines. So fortification and all military sciences, military engineering should be taught. Navigation was, of course, a kind of basic knowledge for most Englishmen because it was very important for them. They were often they had to sail and reach other countries because England was an island, and therefore they had the aspiration of reaching most places in the world by navigation. And in natural philosophy they may proceed leisurely from the history of meteors, minerals, plants and living creatures as far as anatomy. So you see, natural philosophy is science. In the Renaissance, philosophy was of two types, natural philosophy and moral philosophy. So natural philosophy means study of nature, and there Milton includes study of meteors, which means some kind of an astronomy, and minerals, plants and so on, reaching as far as to anatomy. So when one studies living things, anatomy was the latest science in Milton's time. It was the most new discipline or new knowledge. That is, when people started dissecting animal and human bodies and learning about the arrangement of the parts of the body inside it, and therefore anatomy was the new science. Then also in course might be read to them out of some not tedious writer the institution of physics. So physics here means medicine. Institution, that is the basic knowledge about medicine, that they may know the tempers. Tempers here Milton is using largely for humors. So temper means it stands for temperament. So according to the Galenic theory of humor, the four humor, that is the four fluids in the human body, they decided the temperaments of people. So you know that the four humors were blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile, and according to that there were four kinds of people according to which humor predominated in his or her body. So we had sanguinary, phlegmatic, choleric and melancholic kind of people. Melancholic also was the quality of Saturn, and Dürer's famous drawing of Melancholia. Melancholic people would be reflective, they would be absorbed in thought. So melancholy suggested a talent in philosophy and thought also. Even though it was basically excess of melancholy would basically mean a distemper, that is a disease. And the most famous English book on that is Robert Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy. The temper, the humors, the seasons and how to manage a crudity. So temper, a person's physical or mental constitution. Humor, the four humors. Seasons, according to seasons people would have different kinds of sickness or diseases, and the seasons, in the different seasons different humors would be preponderant or dominating, because cold, hot, moist, these attributes, these qualities were associated with the different humors. And crudity means indigestion, which would mean all kinds of diseases related to the bowels or digestion. And Milton says that every man should have some medical knowledge of these things, because Milton's students are going to be in the army also. They are going to be military leaders, and the military leaders should know how to help a soldier if he falls sick. Which he can wisely and timely do, is not only a great physician to himself, and to his friends, but also may at some time or other save an army by the frugal and expenseless means only. That is, if one has some medical knowledge, then he might save an army, save the soldiers in an inexpensive way by treating them. The fact that sometimes soldiers would fall sick in large numbers, it was a very well known fact. It is said that Alexander's army, when they came near India, when they invaded the countries, Iran and neighboring countries, Afghanistan, many of their soldiers fell sick of malaria and other diseases, which was the reason why Alexander had to finally leave. Therefore, it is important for military commanders to have some medical knowledge. So it is a great pity that the stout bodies of young soldiers are rotten away and shameful to the commander. To set forward all these proceedings in nature and mathematics, what hinders, but that they may procure as oft as shall be needful the helpful experiences of hunters, fowlers, fishermen, shepherds, gardeners, apothecaries, and in the other sciences, architects, engineers, mariners, anatomists, who doubtless would be ready, some for reward and some to favour such a hopeful seminary. That is, a seminary, this institution, this educational institution, would not only make the students read a great number of books, but also people who practice some art in their daily lives, they should also be invited to teach the students or to share their experience with the students, like hunters, fowlers, shepherds, apothecaries means those who make medicine, pharmacists, and so on. And this will give them such a real tincture of natural knowledge as they shall never forget, but daily augment with delight. Tincture means an infusion. So the students would learn both theoretical knowledge as well as practical knowledge from the experience of men who practice the different useful arts in their lives. So you see how Milton imagines that a student should not be limited to only theory, but should have a wide knowledge about how people practice their arts, or how people use different kinds of knowledge in their everyday lives. Then also, so after that, Milton comes to literature. It is by this time it has already become a formidable syllabus, but he goes on including more and more. Then also those poets which are now counted most hard will be both facile and pleasant. Orpheus, Hesiod, Theocritus, Aratus, Nicander, Oppian, Dionysius, and in Latin Lucretius, Manilius, and the rural part of virtue. So these poets, they are considered hard or difficult. Why? Because they write on, practical arts like agriculture, hunting, so once students learn about these practical arts from the men who practice them, then they would understand these poems much better, because these poems give us the theory of these arts. So Milton says that instead of coming to practice something after learning the theory, if it is the other way around, you learn the practice first and then you come to the theory, then the theory becomes very easy. So these authors, the books written by, for example, Orpheus was a pre-Homeric poet, and there was a cult of Orpheus. He wrote several poems. Then Hesiod, he is known for theogony and works and days. And though theogony is about the origin of the gods, and works and days about the origin of the world, so though these are great poems or cosmological poems, epic poems, yet they contain many passages about actual lives of people. Theocritus is well known as a great writer of pastoral poetry in Greek. And Theocritus was the model of Virgil's pastoral poems Eclogues. Aratus was a Greek poet. He was the author of Phenomena. Milton taught Aratus to his nephews. So Aratus was well known to him. Nicander was a Greek poet who wrote the didactic poem Theriaka, that is on venomous animals. This book was on venomous animals. Oppian of Cilicia wrote the book Haleutica, a poem on fishes and fishing. But Milton probably had in mind the book Kynegetica, a poem on hunting. Kynegetica was a poem by Oppian on hunting. Dionysius Perigetis wrote a Greek didactic poem about geographical survey of the known world. The name of the poet is Dionysius Perigetis. He wrote a book on cosmology about the known world. Titus Lucretius, you all know that he is famous for De Rerum Natura. Stephen Greenblatt theorized that Lucretius's De Rerum Natura was one of the greatest influences for the Renaissance to happen. It was a poem on Epicurean philosophy, and Lucretius was an atomist. He followed Epicurus's atomistic philosophy. De Rerum Natura means about the nature of things. Manilius wrote a Latin didactic poem named Astronomica. Virgil, of course, Milton refers to Virgil here for not the Aeneid but the Georgics and Eclogues. They were about farming. Eclogues was about the shepherds, that is sheep rearing, and Georgics was about agriculture or farming. So these poems all refer to some kind of practical science. By this time, years and good general precepts will have furnished them more distinctly with that act of reason which in ethics is called proeresis. Proeresis means in Greek, moral choice. Moral choice in Aristotle. Nicomachean ethics. So they will learn some ethics also by this time, that they may with some judgment contemplate upon moral good and evil. Then will be required a special reinforcement of constant and sound indoctrinating to set them right and firm, instructing them more amply in the knowledge of virtue and hatred of vice, while their young and pliant affections are led through all the moral works of Plato, Xenophon, Cicero, Plutarch, Laelius, and those Lockean remnants were still to be reduced in their nightward studies, wherewith they close the day's work. So, at this level, the students would learn moral philosophy, and that will include the works by Plato. Of course, Plato here refers to the Socratic dialogues, and Xenophon. Plato, you know, was a teacher of Aristotle. Xenophon, like Plato, was a student of Socrates. So Socrates was a teacher of Plato and Xenophon, and Plato was a teacher of Aristotle. Cicero, you all know, was a great Roman orator and politician and writer. And Diogenes Laertius wrote lives and opinions of eminent philosophers. Diogenes Laertius. Here Milton only writes Laertius. So his full name is Diogenes Laertius, and he wrote the book Lives and Opinions of Eminent, and those Locrian remnants. The treatise on the soul of the world and nature was attributed to Timaeus of Locri, a character in Plato's Timaeus, but is now considered a 1st century AD paraphrase of the dialogue. So this treatise on the soul of the world and nature, on the soul, it was believed to be written by Timaeus of Locri, falsely believed to be written by Timaeus of Locri, but it was written by somebody in the 1st century who paraphrased the original poem. Milton of course does not know that, so Milton supposes that it is one of the Locrian remnants, that is writings still left intact by Timaeus. Timaeus is one of Plato's dialogues, where Timaeus is the principal character. But still so these are the studies for the daytime, but at night they must study something else. Religion, particularly the sentences of David or Solomon, or the evangels and apostolic scriptures. Being perfect in the knowledge of the personal duty, they may then begin the study of economies. Oikonomicus, written by Aristotle. Economies mean the management of the house. And either now or before this, they may have easily learnt at any odd hour the Italian tongue. So for learning a foreign language, you do not even need a fixed hour. At any odd hour, any spare time, you can learn a language. So the students could learn Italian at any time. And soon after, but with wariness and good antidote, it would be wholesome enough to let them taste some choice comedies, Greek, Latin or Italian. So now Milton is coming to literature proper. And the comedies that, or tragedies, Milton refers, those tragedies also that treat of household matters as Trachiniae, Alcestis and the like. So Trachiniae was written by Sophocles. It tells the story of Deianira, wife of Hercules, who unintentionally poisons her husband and then commits suicide. So you see, these are household problems for Milton. So and Alcestis was written by Euripides. It depicts the faithful wife Alcestis dying for her husband and rescued from the underworld by Hercules. The next remove must be to the study of politics. So politics is an important subject, but we see that it is studied much later because it requires a mature mind. To know the beginning, end and reasons of political societies, that they may not, in a dangerous fit of the Commonwealth, be such poor, shaken, uncertain reeds of such a tottering conscience as many of our great counsellors have lately shown themselves. So here we have an implied criticism of the counsellors, that is the modern Milton's contemporary members of the parliament who have displayed a lack of confidence, and Milton compares them to tottering reeds. So a man who understands politics properly should not be lacking in confidence and should be like a pillar than a tottering reed. As many of our great counsellors have lately shown themselves, but uncertain reeds of such a tottering conscience, as many of our great counsellors have lately shown themselves but steadfast pillars of the state. So Milton criticizes some of the counsellors who appear to be lacking in confidence, but they should be pillars of the state. So in order to be pillars of the state, one must know politics and understand politics well. And they must learn the grounds of law and legal justice, delivered first and with best warrant by Moses. Moses was considered the first lawgiver because he gave his people the 10 commandments, which were which was the first law. And then Grecian lawgivers, Moses was Hebrew. Then after him the Grecian lawgivers, Lycurgus, Solon, Seleucus, Charondas, and thence the Roman edicts and tables with their Justinian. So Milton charts here a history of law, you may say. The original law was given by Moses, then the Greek writers, then the Roman writers, finally the Saxon kings, the common law of England. Lycurgus was the founder of Sparta's constitution. Solon was an Athenian legislator and poet. Seleucus, 7th century BC, lawgiver, Greek lawgiver and author of written legal code. Charondas, lawgiver of Catana in Sicily. The edicts refer to the proclaimed laws. The Romans, they proclaimed certain laws as edicts and then they became acceptable. The tables refer to the 12 tables, the earliest Roman code of laws. Then Saxon kings, common law. So you know that in Renaissance England, in medieval England also there were two kinds of law, common law and canon law. So common law was the law given by the Saxon kings and canon law was the law, a different law for the church. Then the Justinian codes. Justinian was the Byzantine emperor who gave us a detailed legal code in writing, which the lawyers had to study. And Sundays also and every evening maybe now understandingly spent in the highest matters of theology. So whenever there is a holiday, holiday means a holy day, which means that you either practice religion or you study religion. So for Milton, Sundays and any other day would be appropriate for studying theology, church history, ancient and modern. And at this time the Hebrew tongue at a set hour might have been gained. Hebrew was taught in some select colleges in the Renaissance. For that a set hour is necessary. For Italian no set hour is necessary. But Hebrew is a classical language, it requires much more rigorous training. That the scriptures may be now read in their own original, whereto it would be no impossibility to add the Chaldee and the Syrian dialect. So some of these scriptures were written in the Aramaic dialect. Chaldee means Aramaic. Syrian, which is the Syriac dialect. So there was the Syriac Bible, the Bible written in Syriac language. Syriac was one of the ancient languages. When all these employments are well conquered, then will the choice histories, heroic poems and Attic tragedies of the stateliest and most regal argument with all the famous political orations offer themselves. So after one learns and reads religion thoroughly, religious scriptures thoroughly, after that one must learn or read histories, heroic poems and so on, Attic tragedies. Attic tragedy means tragedies written in Athens, political orations by Cicero, Demosthenes, these were very important. So Milton is coming to that. As might be taught, would endue them even with the spirit and vigour of Demosthenes or Cicero, Euripides or Sophocles. Demosthenes, was the Greek orator and writer of rhetoric, and Cicero was of course the most famous Roman orator and philosopher. After this, Milton comes to logic and rhetoric. And now lastly will be the time to read with them those organic arts. Organic arts because they are part of the organon. The word organon means tools. So they are tools of knowledge, which enable men to discourse and write perspicuously, elegantly and according to the fitted style of the lofty, mean or lowly. So there were three standard styles in ancient writing, the grand style, the middle style and the low style. So Milton says that that is taught by rhetoric and that should be learned later in the course. So one comes to logic, and Milton here refers to the image of logic as a contracted palm or closed fist, and rhetoric as an open palm. This image is taken from Zeno. It was a very popular image in the Renaissance. Logic was compared to a closed fist and rhetoric was compared to an open palm. Logic therefore, so much as is useful, is to be referred to this due place with all her well couched heads and topics, referring to topical logic. Milton himself wrote a book of logic, therefore he knew the tradition of logic very well. Heads and topics, until it be time to open her contracted palm into a graceful and ornate rhetoric taught out of the rule of Plato, Aristotle, Philebus, Cicero, Hermogenes, Longinus. So after logic one should learn rhetoric, and the authors of rhetoric that one should study are these. So beginning from Plato. Plato was a writer well versed in rhetoric. Philebus was an Athenian orator, statesman and philosopher. Hermogenes of Tarsus, here Milton refers to Hermogenes. He was a Greek rhetorician and wrote on the types of style. So I was telling you about the three styles, grand, middle and low. Hermogenes was the principal writer on style. Longinus you are familiar with, his book on the sublime, to which poetry would be made subsequent. So after learning logic and rhetoric, then one can come to poetry, which means that poetry is a difficult art, and with poetry automatically poetics could also come into view. I mean not here the prosody of a verse which they could not but have hit on before among the rudiments of grammar, but that sublime art which in Aristotle's Poetics, in Horace and the Italian commentaries of Castelvetro, Tasso, Mazzoni and others teaches what the laws of a true epic poem, what of a dramatic, what of lyric, what decorum is, which is the grand master is to observe. So Milton says that by study of poetry I do not mean prosody, because prosody is something very elementary, the study of meter, which is like grammar, learned at an early stage. But Milton says that here I am referring to poetics, the theory of poetry, and he refers to Aristotle, Horace, and the Italian neoclassical writers and critics, Castelvetro, Tasso, Mazzoni. Castelvetro was an Italian scholar who wrote a famous commentary on Aristotle's Poetics. Tasso you know as an epic poet, but he also wrote on how to write poetry. Mazzoni was a friend of Tasso and a critic. He wrote a defense of Dante's Commedia. decorum was a well-known law of ancient poetic theory. So the different genres of epic, dramatic and lyric poems, these are to be taught, these are to be learned from the study of poetics. This would make them soon perceive what despicable creature our common rhymers and playwrights be, and show them what religious, what glorious and magnificent use might be made of poetry, both in divine and human things. So here Milton writes very briefly a kind of a defense of poetry and says that our contemporary writers of poetry and drama, they are despicable creatures because they did not study all this theory of poetry, and if they studied it, then they would know that to what divine use poetry might be subjected. So poetry can be very useful both in divine and human things. From hence and not till now will be the right season of forming them to be able writers and composers in every excellent matter, when they shall be the spot with an universal insight into things. So this thrust of making one a good writer, that is a humanist thrust. The whole purpose of this study was to make one a very efficient writer, one who would have universal insight. So unless writing has some universality about it, unless one is able to examine the ways of the world very deeply and come to certain universal generalizations, that writing will not be valuable to everybody. Or whether they be to speak in parliament or council, honor and attention would be waiting on their lips. So the students thus taught, thus trained, they would either be great writers or they would be great parliamentarians, leaders, orators. There would then also appear in pulpits other visages, other gestures and stuff otherwise wrought than what we now sit under, oftentimes to as great a trial of our patience as any other that they preach to us. So here Milton is critical of the quality of the preachers in England. He says that their quality is very poor and their sermons try our patience. It is very difficult to sit through those sermons, but if students are trained in this manner, then they would also make very good preachers, and we will see good preachers in our pulpits. These are the studies wherein our noble and our gentle youth ought to bestow their time in a disciplinary way from 12 to 1 and 20. So this whole course of studies is meant for students from the age of 12 to 21. Unless they rely more upon their ancestors dead than upon themselves living. That is, if children want to succeed in their lives of their own, by their own qualities, then they must have this kind of an education. But if they think that their ancestors will die and leave them property, and they are only eyeing that inheritance, then they need not study. So that is something despicable. In which methodical course it is so supposed they must proceed by the steady pace of learning onward, as at convenient times, for memory's sake, to retire back into the middle word and sometimes into the rear of what they have been taught, until they have confirmed and solidly united the whole body of their perpetual knowledge, like the last embattling of a Roman legion. So here Milton is comparing once again studies to military regimentation, and as a general, when he inspects his army, he now goes to the front of the army, next he goes to the rear of the army, Sometimes he goes to the middle of the army, and in this manner he inspects every part of the army. Similarly, a student should inspect his knowledge by going through memory backward and forward and examining his entire training, his entire course of learning, to check whether he has perfected his knowledge or not. And with this, Milton comes to the end of this topic of studies and comes to the topic of exercise. Do you have any question at this point? Okay, so I continue, and I think that we will be able to finish the essay today. So Milton comes to the exercise. Now, as you know that exercise here means physical exercise, and though in case of Milton one would think of the remissed heads of nature, art and exercise, natura, arts and praxis, but here exercise means physical exercise. The course of study hitherto briefly described is what I can guess by reading, likest to those ancient and famous schools of Pythagoras, Plato, Isocrates, Aristotle and such others, out of which were bred up such a number of renowned philosophers, orators, historians, poets and princes all over Greece, Italy and Asia, besides the flourishing studies of Cyrene and Alexandria. So Milton compares his course of studies to the ancient course of studies taught in the schools of Pythagoras, Plato and Isocrates. And that ancient course of studies produced great philosophers, orators, historians, poets and so on. And also the studies, Milton refers to the studies practiced in Alexandria and Cyrene. Cyrene was a city of Greek culture in Libya. So these two places, Alexandria and Cyrene, they were great places of learning in ancient Greek civilization. But herein it shall exceed them and supply a defect as great as that which Plato noted in the Commonwealth of Sparta, whereas that city trained up their youth most for war, and these in their academies and lyceum. So Milton says that the course of study that I have prescribed, that will improve upon the ancient courses of studies, because the defect of the ancient course of studies, as mentioned by Plato, that in Sparta the maximum emphasis was on physical exercise, whereas in Athens the maximum emphasis was in reading and studying. So Milton says that we should not overemphasize any of these aspects, but we should place more or less balanced emphasis on both study and exercise. Sparta trained their youth mostly for war, and Athens and other towns, Greek towns, they trained in their academies and lyceum, the schools, all for the gown. That is, the gown was worn by the scholar in medieval university. So the bookish learning that was disseminated in these ancient Greek cities, this institution of breeding, which I here delineate, shall be equally good both for peace and war. So that is what Milton said at the very beginning of this letter, that education would mean that students would inculcate, would develop certain virtues, certain qualities, which would be found useful both during peace and when at war. So Milton says that I also suggest that students should be ready, should have qualities that would help them both during peace and when at war. Therefore, about an hour and a half ere they eat at noon should be allowed them for exercise and due rest afterwards. But the time for this may be enlarged at pleasure according as their rising in the morning shall be early. So, in order to pack so many things in their day's schedule, they must rise early in the morning. Before their lunch, they should have some exercise. The exercise which I recommend first is the exact use of their weapon. So Milton here refers to sword fighting, which every nobleman had to learn in the 16th and 17th centuries. The sword was a weapon of noblemen. Those who were not noble, they were not allowed to carry swords. So sword fighting was considered a very privileged and elite kind of training. To guard and to strike safely with edge or point, this will keep them healthy, nimble, strong and well in breath. It is also the likeliest means to make them grow large and tall and to inspire them with a gallant and fearless courage, which being tempered with seasonable lectures and precepts to them of truth, fortitude and patience, will turn into a native and heroic valor and make them hate the cowardice of doing wrong. So sword fighting is not mere fighting, but it inculcates in the students the admiration for valor, for courage and heroism, hatred for cowardice. They must be also practiced. So after sword fighting, Milton speaks of wrestling. They must be also practiced in all the locks and gripes of wrestling, wherein Englishmen were wont to excel, as need may often be in fight to tug, to grapple and to close. Englishmen must learn to excel in wrestling and learn the different grips and locks. And these perhaps will be enough wherein to prove and heed their single strength, that is their individual strength. The interim of unsweating themselves regularly and convenient rest before meat may both with profit and delight be taken up in recreating and composing their traveled spirit with the solemn and divine harmonies of music, art or learned, either while the skillful organist plies his grave and fancied descant in lofty fugues, or the whole symphony with artful and unimaginable touches adorn and grace the well-studied chords of some choice composer. Sometimes the lute or soft organ stop waiting on elegant voices, either to religious, martial or civil duties. So after some exercise of sword fighting or wrestling, and then after resting themselves, they would have their food, and probably during their lunch some good music will be played. We all know that Milton was a great lover of music, and he refers to music also in Paradise Lost. So music should be played, either it could be an organ or a lute or some kind of descant. Descant means an instrumental prelude consisting of variations on a given theme. So either it could be symphony or it could be a single solo player playing some instrument. And the music could be religious or martial or civil. So there could be songs also sung by people, which, if men and prophets be not extremely out, have a great power over dispositions and manners to smooth and make them gentle from rustic harshness and distempered passions. So music has a civilizing quality, as it was believed in the Orpheus myth that Orpheus by his music would charm the animals, and even the violent animals, they would sit quietly and enjoy. So barbaric people would also be civilized by listening to music. The life also would not be inexpedient after need to assist and cherish nature in her first concoction, and send their minds back to study in good tune and satisfaction. That is, music would help students in their digestion. Concoction means digestion. And once they digest their food, then they can go back to their studies. While having followed it close under vigilant eyes till about 2 hours before supper, there by a sudden alarm or watchword to be called out to their military motions under sky or covert according to the season, as was the Roman wont. So there would be a sudden alarm or some kind of bell would be rung, by which they would be called to have some training in military exercises. Embattling, marching, encamping, fortifying, besieging and battering. So these are the exercises that train one for either laying a siege to a castle. With a battering ram one would batter the castle door and enter it. Or the training of fortification, how to maintain a fort. With all the helps of ancient modern stratagems, tactics and warlike maxims, they may, as it were, out of a long war come forth renowned and perfect commanders in the service of their country. So actual military training is also included in Milton's syllabus. They would not then, if they were trusted with fair and hopeful armies, suffer them for want of just and wise discipline to shed away from about them like thick feathers, though they be never so oft supplied. They would not suffer them empty and unrecruitable colonels of 20 men in a company to puff out. So Milton says that students who have been trained in this manner in the military arts, they will not be military leaders whose soldiers fall away like feathers. They will not suffer empty and unrecruitable colonels of 20 men. That unrecruitable, that is incapable of getting recruits. So one of the important tasks of a military leader is to recruit men. So a good military leader would be able to attract other men to his leadership and recruit them. So they will not lack soldiers. Conveying to secret hoards the wages of a delusive list, and a miserable remnant yet in the meanwhile to be overmastered with a score or two of drunkards. So those who are not trained in this manner, they would not have good soldiers, and they would mostly have drunken men as their soldiers, who do not have any discipline. Only soldiery left about them, or else to comply with all rapine and violences. No, certainly, if they knew aught of that knowledge that belonged to good men or good governors, they would not suffer these things. Military leaders, that is, students who have been trained in this fashion, they would be good leaders and they would have good soldiers. They will not lack. But to return to our own institute, besides these constant exercises at home, there is another opportunity of gaining experience to be won from pleasure itself abroad. So here comes this Renaissance idea that travel is an important part of education. Most Englishmen, noblemen in the 16th and 17th centuries would travel to Europe to complete their education. As Milton himself toured Europe in his youth, and Bacon also writes about this in his essay of travels. So travel is considered an important part of education. So one should go abroad, leave one's home and learn about other countries. In those vernal seasons of the year when the air is calm and pleasant, it were an injury and sullenness against nature not to go out and see her riches and partake in her rejoicing with heaven and earth. During spring, when the weather is temperate, then it is sinful, Milton says, not to go out, not to travel. So one should travel. I should not therefore be a persuader to them of studying much then, after 2 or 3 years that they have well laid their grounds, but to ride out in companies with prudent and staid guides to all the quarters of the land. To those who have already studied for 2-3 years, they should then go abroad, but with some guide, learned guide who can guide them in their travel. Learning and observing all places of strength, all commodities of building and of soil. Commodities means good features, useful features. So when one travels to a place, one should learn the useful features or qualities of that place, the soil, the climate and everything. For towns and villages, harbours and ports for trade. Sometimes taking sea as far as to our navy to learn there also what they can in the practical knowledge of sailing and of sea fight. The practical knowledge in navigation and in sea fight. These waves would try all their peculiar gifts of nature, and if there were any secret excellence among them, would fetch it out and give it fair opportunities to advance itself by, which could not but mightily redound to the good of this nation, and bring into fashion again those old admired virtues and excellencies with far more advantage now in this purity of Christian knowledge. This purity of Christian knowledge, because now that England is being ruled by the Puritans, and the course of study that Milton would prescribe, that would be mostly according to the Puritan Christian knowledge. So Milton says that now more than before, by traveling or by learning sea fight, by fighting with the waves, one would be trained, and all hidden talents would be brought out when one would be put to extremities, like fighting the waves, and they would be far better trained than in earlier times. Nor shall they need the Monsieur of Paris to take our hopeful youth into their slight and prodigal custodies and send them over back again, transformed into mimics, apes and peep-shows. So here we see a hatred for the French, the Monsieur of Paris. English people had from the Renaissance itself some dislike for the other nations like the French and the Italians. The primary reason of dislike was that these nations were Roman Catholics. But the French nations were considered effeminate, and the Italian nations were considered vain. And both these nations were considered loose in morality. We have in the writings of Sir Walter Raleigh, is it Raleigh or Ascham? Probably Roger Ascham, Roger Ascham, that those who come back from their travels, English youths who come back from their European tours, they mimic or they bring with them some foreign mannerisms. So they try to speak in an affected accent, like the French or the Italians, and mimic the gestures of the French and the Italians. As you may know that the French and the Italian, the Europeans of the continent, they use much more gesture of body, face or shoulders than the English people. And when English people try to mimic them, they appear to be, practicing a kind of mannerism. And Ascham was very critical of this false mannerism, and he wrote that an Italianate gentleman is an incarnate devil. There was an Italian proverb that actually quotes that an Englishman who is Italianated, he is an incarnate of the devil. Similarly, those who affected French manners, they were considered feminine, and disliked by the English people. And they were called kickshaws. And this word kickshaws, it comes from the French word quelque chose, two words actually. Quelque chose means something. And Shakespeare uses this word in Twelfth Night, where Sir Andrew mentions the word kickshaws. So here Milton also is mentioning the same word. So those who imitate or mimic French manner, they are like apes. So if the English youth travel following Milton's prescription, and then they come back much better, and they would be much superior to others who merely mimic the French like apes. Now lastly, for the diet. So finally, in the last paragraph, Milton speaks of diet. There cannot be much to say save only that it would be best in the same house, for much time else would be lost abroad. That is, the diet should be taken in the same house. And many ill habits got, and that it should be plain, healthful and moderate, I suppose is out of controversy. Which means that the food should be taken in the institution itself and should not be taken outside, that is from shops or restaurants. So the institution should provide healthy food. Thus, Master Hartley, you have a general view in writing as your desire was of that which at several times I had discoursed with you concerning the best and noblest way of education, not beginning as some have done from that cradle, which yet might be worth many considerations. If brevity had not been my scope, many other circumstances also I could have mentioned. So Milton says that I have mentioned my ideas on education here very briefly. But this to such as have the worth in them to make trial for light and direction may be enough. Only I believe that this is not a bow for every man to shoot in that counts himself a teacher. This education, Milton says, cannot be disseminated, cannot be given by any teacher, like a common bow which can be stringed by anybody. Milton here alludes to the image of Ulysses' bow, which only he could string. Therefore Milton says that only a limited number of teachers would be able to impart this kind of an education. It will require sinews almost equal to those which Homer gave Ulysses, yet I am withal persuaded that it may prove much more easy in the essay than it now seems at distance. Essay or essay means attempt. So Milton says that it appears to be formidable and difficult, but if one attempts it, then it would appear much easier. So we have finished the essay of education. And we have seen that here mostly the education that Milton suggests, it is based upon humanist kind of learning. That is, there should be a thorough grounding in the languages, classical and modern. One should read Greek and Latin writings not only on literature but also on agriculture and other sciences, and one should also spend some time after religious practice and learning of theology, along with solid study of all the different disciplines that Milton mentions one after another. One should also exercise, and in exercise Milton includes military training as well as training in practical arts. So in the theoretical part of learning also he included the assistance by professional people who practice different kinds of art, fishing, hunting and so on, so that students have a knowledge about the practical aspect of things also. Then he goes on to talk about the military training that would make one an able leader who can recruit soldiers during the times of war. And all the arts, all the tactics of fortification or seizing a castle, all those should be taught. So in this course of education, students would automatically develop a knowledge in virtue and vice, that is moral philosophy. So natural philosophy or natural sciences, those are theoretical aspects of training, but while reading poetry or drama, one would also come to inculcate certain moral virtues and vices. Therefore, for Milton, this education is an education which is guided by the light of puritanical Christian knowledge. Therefore, according to Milton, this education is going to make the students much superior to students of earlier times who did not have this enlightenment, this light of spiritual truth, or this light of true Christian training as in Milton. Do you have any questions? If you look at the questions that I have given, you will see that they are very simple. Okay, so you see the first question, Milton offers a humanist program of education. So this is what I was saying. By humanist program, one would refer to the imparting of knowledge in grammar, logic, rhetoric, and all the liberal arts. The liberal arts includes politics, economics, civics, and music, arithmetic, astronomy, geometry, and so on. So basically the trivium and quadrivium pattern is followed, but Milton suggests that grammar should be taught early. However, logic and rhetoric should be taught much later. So here he differs from the traditional notion that the trivium, grammar, logic and rhetoric, should be all taught in childhood. Milton suggests that only when one becomes a little mature, only then logic and rhetoric as well as politics should be taught. Therefore, all arts cannot be taught in childhood, and there is a kind of a gradation in his system, and he indicates which art should be taught earlier and which should be taught later, as he envisages that the students should follow this course from the age of 12 to 21. And at the end of the conventional humanist program of education, conventional learning, one should travel, one should go abroad in order to complete one's education. And you can also say why this is humanist, because the values of justice, prudence, tolerance, the different values which Milton mentions here, which can be inculcated by such course of learning, they are mostly humanist values. That is, values upheld by the humanists. The next question has Milton's definition of education. The end of learning is to repair the ruins of our first parents by beginning to know God aright. Does Milton offer a theological view of education? Yes, it is a theological view because Milton suggests that our knowledge has been impaired by our fall. Before that, one's knowledge was perfect, and therefore the purpose of education is to repair it, and to repair the ruins of our first parents. That is possible only when one knows God aright, that is, through true Christian knowledge, through true religious knowledge about Christianity. Therefore, the entire idea of education inculcated or expressed here is framed by this overarching notion of true Christianity that would be the guiding light for this education, which Milton mentions at the beginning of the essay and also towards the end of the essay, when he says that students would be much superior and more perfect than those who were taught in ancient times, because these students have the light of the true Christian religion, or Puritan knowledge, as Milton calls it. The next question: I call therefore a complete and generous education that which fits a man to perform justly, skillfully and magnanimously all the offices, both private and public, of peace and war. This is also a definition of education, and here how do you reconcile this view of education with beginning to know God aright? That is a tricky question, but actually whether Milton gives a holistic view of education or not, there is no contradiction. Is there any contradiction between the view that education should be theologically motivated and guided, and that education should also help one in public and private realms and during the times of peace and war? So Milton does not see any contradiction in this, because for a Puritan, any life, whether in public or in private, any conduct, whether in public or in private, whether during war or at peacetime, all conducts for a Christian should be guided by the light of Christianity. Therefore, there is no contradiction between this view and the view that one should know God aright. That is, one should have a perfect or proper theological knowledge. Language and literature have pride of place in Milton's scheme of education. So this is actually an echo of the first question, that is the humanist program of education. We all know that the humanists emphasized the learning of languages, and in this essay Milton mentions a great number of languages, the classical languages, including, apart from Greek, Latin and Hebrew, Aramaic and Syriac. And among the modern languages he mentions only Italian, which suggests that he was much more interested in Italian, probably because of Dante, Dante's Divine Comedy. And he also mentions a number of Italian neoclassical critics like Tasso and Mazzoni, Castelvetro and so on. Then literature, Milton refers to almost all the important literary genres, tragedy, comedy, pastoral, eclogues, and refers to the ancient, mostly ancient literary works. And he does not mention much the modern or the contemporary European literary works, because he perhaps assumes that one would, out of their own interest, one would read modern European literature. So modern European literature was not an important subject of formal study in Milton's time, as it is in our time. So in our time, the ancient literature has become of less importance, unfortunately. Modern literature has become more important. In Milton's time, the modern European literature, that was taken for granted, that one would read contemporary writing. So Milton emphasizes or focuses on ancient literature. So of course we may conclude that language and literature have a private place in this. Okay, so I have discussed the questions. So anything else that is left to discuss? Do you have any other question or comment?